On a Tuesday evening in 1965, Harold Jenkins walked into the Elks Lodge in Toledo, Ohio, shook hands with 43 men, debated the city's new highway proposal for 90 minutes, and then stayed until midnight playing cards and sharing stories about the war. This wasn't unusual. Harold did this every Tuesday. So did millions of other Americans in thousands of lodges, clubs, and meeting halls across the country. By 1997, Harold still went to the Elks Lodge every Tuesday. But now he shook hands with 7 men, most of them over 70. The highway debates had stopped. The card games ended by 9. And when Harold died in 2003, the lodge closed its doors forever. The building is now a self-storage facility. This is the story you've never been told about America. Not the story of dramatic collapse, not the tale of a single catastrophic event, but something far stranger and more unsettling. The story of how Americans simply stopped showing up, stopped gathering, stopped joining. The story of how in just 3 decades, the entire social infrastructure of the United States quietly dissolved like sugar in rain. And most of us never even noticed it happening. In 1975, there were more than 120,000 active bowling leagues in America. Real leagues with matching shirts, score sheets, and seasonal tournaments. By 1995, there were 25,000. But here's the twist that puzzled sociologists. Americans were actually bowling more than ever. Bowling alley revenue was up. The number of games bowled increased. People hadn't stopped bowling. They'd stopped bowling together. Political scientist Robert Putnam called this bowling alone, and he meant it as a metaphor for something much bigger than recreational sports. He meant it as a diagnosis of a dying nation. The numbers tell a story so stark it almost doesn't seem real. Between 1973 and 1994, participation in parent-teacher organizations dropped by more than half. The number of Americans who attended even one public meeting about town or school affairs in the previous year fell by more than 1/3. Membership in the Red Cross, the Boy Scouts, the Lions Club, the Jaycees, the Masons, the Shriners, the Elks, the Moose, the Eagles. All these organizations that once defined American civic life hemorrhaged members at rates that would bankrupt most businesses. The League of Women Voters lost 42% of its members between 1969 and 1997. The Jaycees lost 44%. The Red Cross shrank by 61%. But it's the church story that hits differently, because in America, churches weren't just about religion. They were the social infrastructure, the meeting places, the community centers, the organizational backbone of democratic life. In 1958, a Gallup poll found that 49% of Americans had attended church or synagogue in the previous 7 days. By 1998, it was 40%. Today, it's 31%. But those numbers actually hide the real story because they're averaged across generations. For Americans under 30, regular church attendance has dropped from 50% in 1972 to 22% in 2022. The median age of a United Methodist churchgoer is now 57. For the Presbyterian Church USA, it's 63. Between 2000 and 2020, more than 6,000 Christian churches closed their doors every single year. That's 16 churches closing every day. Small-town churches, urban megachurches, rural congregations that had held services every Sunday since 1847, just quietly closing. Selling the building, scattering the congregation. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig into the stories that explain the world you're actually living in. Before we go further, I'm genuinely curious. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I read them all, and I'm fascinated by how these global patterns play out in your specific communities. Now, here's what makes this collapse so eerie. It didn't happen because of persecution or war or economic catastrophe. It happened during the longest period of peace and prosperity in American history. It happened while Americans got richer, lived longer, and had more leisure time than ever before. Something was pulling people apart during the exact decades when they had the most time to be together. Let me take you to Muncie, Indiana. In the 1920s, sociologists Robert and Helen Lind chose Muncie as the most typical American city they could find. And they studied it obsessively, documenting every detail of civic life. They called it Middletown. In 1924, Muncie had 443 active civic organizations for a population of 35,000. That's one organization for every 79 people. There were Sunday schools, literary societies, business clubs, labor unions, women's clubs, fraternal lodges, athletic clubs, garden societies, and dozens of others. The average middle-class family in Muncie belonged to 3.2 organizations. By 1977, when sociologists returned to update the study, Muncie's population had tripled. The number of civic organizations had stayed almost exactly the same. The average family now belonged to 1.1 organizations. What happened? What changed? The most obvious suspect is television. In 1950, 9% of American households owned a TV. By 1960, it was 90%. Robert Putnam calculated that every hour of television watching per day reduces civic participation by roughly 10%. It's not just that TV takes up time, though it does. Americans now watch an average of 4.5 hours per day. It's that TV fundamentally changed what Americans expected from their leisure time. Before television, entertainment required organization. You had to gather people, plan events, coordinate schedules. After television, entertainment required nothing but proximity to a screen. Sociability became optional. But television is only part of the story. Because even when Americans did leave their houses, they were joining different kinds of organizations. In 1992, the Sierra Club had 63% more members than it had in 1985. The American Association of Retired Persons went from 400,000 members in 1960 to 33 million in 2000. So Americans were still joining things. They were just joining things differently. These new organizations, researchers noticed, had something in common. They didn't actually require you to show up anywhere. You sent a check, you got a newsletter, you were a member, but you never met another member. You never sat in a meeting hall and debated whether to support the new highway. You never played cards with other members until midnight. You were connected to a cause, but not to other people. Sociologist Robert Wuthnow called this loose connection and argued it represented a fundamental shift in American social life, from communities based on geography and face-to-face interaction to communities based on shared interests and mail-in membership. The suburban revolution accelerated everything. In 1940, 13% of Americans lived in suburbs. By 1990, it was 50%. And suburbs were designed specifically to minimize unplanned social interaction. No front porches, no corner stores, no town squares, no sidewalks. Just houses, garages, and lawns. Your commute to work grew longer every year. The average American now spends 27.6 minutes driving to work, alone in a car. By the time you got home, fed the kids, and relaxed, there were maybe 2 waking hours left. Who had time for a Tuesday night Elks Lodge meeting? Women entering the workforce in massive numbers also transformed civic life, though not in the way you might think. Between 1960 and 2000, the percentage of married women working outside the home went from 32% to 61%. The counterintuitive part is that working women were actually more likely to be involved in civic organizations than homemakers throughout the 1980s and 1990s. The problem was that the traditional civic infrastructure had assumed someone would be home during the day. Someone who could volunteer for the school fundraiser, organize the church potluck, run the garden club. When that stopped being true, entire categories of civic organizations simply collapsed. The PTA is perhaps the saddest example. In 1960, there were 12 million PTA members. By 1995, there were 6.5 million, despite the fact that there were more school-age children and more two-parent households. The parents were just too exhausted, too scheduled, too overwhelmed to show up for meetings. And when they didn't show up, the meetings stopped happening. And when the meetings stopped happening, the connections that parents made with each other, the safety net, the information sharing, the sense of collective responsibility for children, all of that vanished too. Here's a fact that haunts me. In 1974, 73% of Americans said they had dinner with their family every night. By 1999, it was 34%. Dinner, the most basic form of human gathering. The thing humans have done together for literally hundreds of thousands of years. And Americans in a single generation mostly stopped doing it. Not because they were starving or working in coal mines. Because they were busy, or tired, or scheduled differently, or eating in the car between soccer practice and music lessons. The trust data is even more disturbing. In 1960, 58% of Americans agreed with the statement, "Most people can be trusted." By 2014, it was 32%. That's not a small shift. That's a civilization-level change in how people perceive other humans. And here's the correlation that Putnam spent years documenting. The more time you spend in civic organizations, the more you trust other people. The more you interact with neighbors, strangers, and fellow citizens in structured settings, the more you believe humans are fundamentally trustworthy. When those structured settings disappeared, trust disappeared with them. Churches, it turns out, weren't just about religion. They were trust factories. In the 1950s and 1960s, church members were substantially more likely to vote, volunteer, donate to charity, work on community projects, and help neighbors than non-members. Not because churches made people more moral, but because churches were where people learned how to work together. You joined a committee. You planned an event. You showed up when you said you would. You contributed to something larger than yourself. You practiced citizenship. When those churches closed, the practice stopped. By 2020, Americans who never attended religious services were 40% less likely to volunteer for any organization, 30% less likely to vote in local elections, and 50% less likely to know their neighbors' names. But the collapse wasn't evenly distributed. It followed demographic patterns that reveal uncomfortable truths about American society. Working-class communities collapsed faster than professional communities. White evangelical churches held membership better than mainline Protestant churches. Rural areas lost civic infrastructure faster than cities. The Americans who stayed connected were disproportionately wealthy, educated, and urban. The Americans who lost connection were disproportionately poor, less educated, and rural. The very people who most needed social safety nets watched those nets dissolve. Let me tell you about the opioid epidemic through this lens, because nobody talks about it this way. Between 1999 and 2020, more than 500,000 Americans died from opioid overdoses. The counties with the highest death rates weren't the poorest counties. They weren't the counties with the worst healthcare access. They were the counties with the lowest rates of civic participation. The counties where people bowled alone, where churches had closed, where the Rotary Club had disbanded, where neighbors didn't know each other's names. Researchers found that a one standard deviation decrease in civic engagement predicted opioid death rates more accurately than unemployment, income, or education levels. The deaths weren't just about pain and pills, they were about isolation. COVID-19 revealed just how completely American civic infrastructure had collapsed. When the pandemic hit, the government told Americans to rely on their communities. Mutual aid networks, neighborhood support systems, civic organizations that could coordinate care and resources. And in most places, those systems just didn't exist anymore. The churches that could have organized food distribution had closed. The civic clubs that could have coordinated elder care had disbanded. The tight-knit neighborhoods that could have looked after vulnerable people had been replaced by subdivisions where nobody knew who lived 3 houses down. Americans were told to lean on communities that had stopped existing 30 years ago. Young Americans grew up in this world, and they don't even know what they're missing. If you're under 30, you've never lived in an America with high civic participation. You've never experienced what it feels like to live in a neighborhood where most people know each other, where someone would notice if you didn't show up for a few days, where collective decisions were made through face-to-face debate rather than social media arguments. This feels normal to you. But to sociologists studying long-term social trends, this looks like civilizational collapse in slow motion. The mental health data supports this in ways that are hard to ignore. Depression rates have nearly tripled since 2000. Anxiety disorders have doubled. Loneliness has reached epidemic levels. 61% of Americans now report feeling seriously lonely much of the time, up from 46% just 5 years ago. The Surgeon General declared loneliness a public health crisis in 2023. But here's what nobody's saying clearly. This isn't a medical crisis. It's a social crisis. It's the predictable result of dismantling every institution that existed to connect people to each other. Here's the question nobody wants to ask. What if we can't build it back? What if the social infrastructure that took 300 years to create can't be recreated in a generation? The Elks Lodge in Toledo isn't reopening. The teenagers who might join it are at home on Discord servers instead. The parents who might run the PTA are managing their kids' schedules through group texts. The workers who might join a union are freelancing in the gig economy. The churchgoers who might organize the food drive are sleeping in on Sundays for the first time in their lives and they're not sure they miss it. College students today join fewer clubs than any generation in American history. They have more friends in theory, but fewer close friends. They attend fewer parties. They report lower levels of spontaneous social interaction. They're lonelier than their grandparents who lived through the Depression. And when you ask them why they don't join organizations, they say they're too busy. But time use studies show they have more free time than students in 1980. They're just spending it differently. They're spending it alone. The workplace used to fill some of this gap. In 1970, 30% of Americans said their closest friends were from work. By 2020, it was 12%. Remote work, which accelerated during COVID and never reversed, might be finishing off whatever workplace community remained. You can work an entire career now without ever sitting in an office, eating lunch with colleagues, or having unplanned conversations by the coffee machine. You can be more productive, more flexible, more comfortable, and more completely alone. Some researchers argue we're just in a transition period, that humans always find ways to connect, that we're building new forms of community online, that Discord servers and Reddit communities and Facebook groups are the new Elks Lodges. But the research suggests otherwise. Online communities don't produce the same levels of trust, reciprocity, or civic engagement as face-to-face communities. They don't teach you how to work with people you disagree with. They don't force you to compromise, coordinate, or contribute. They're easier to join and easier to leave, which makes them fundamentally different from the kinds of sticky, demanding, life-shaping communities that Americans used to belong to. The Scandinavian countries offer an interesting comparison. Sweden, Norway, and Denmark also experienced television, suburbanization, and women entering the workforce. But they maintained much higher levels of civic participation and social trust. Why? Government policy. These countries actively subsidized civic organizations. They built infrastructure that encouraged gathering. They created policies that gave people time to participate in community life. America did the opposite. America subsidized suburban sprawl, built highways that encouraged commuting, and created tax policies that rewarded individual consumption over collective investment. The collapse wasn't inevitable. It was a choice, or more accurately, 1,000 small choices that added up to a transformation. Before I leave you with this story, if you found this valuable, if you're glad this channel exists doing the research and telling these stories nobody else is telling, hitting the super thanks button genuinely helps me keep making these. Just putting that out there. So where does this leave us? How do you rebuild community in a country that's forgotten what community feels like? Some Americans are trying. The intentional community movement has grown every year since 2010. Co-housing projects, where people deliberately live in proximity and share common spaces, have tripled in number. Tool libraries, time banks, community gardens. Small-scale experiments in rebuilding social infrastructure have proliferated. But they remain tiny, marginal, serving maybe 1% of the population. They're beautiful experiments. They're not a solution at the scale of the problem. Churches are trying to adapt with mixed results. Megachurches grew during the decades when traditional churches collapsed, but even they're shrinking now.